everyone, to tonight's seminar, hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group, part of the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK Law. Tonight's seminar will involve the presentation and discussion of Professor Jason Buhi's The Constitutional History of Macau. Dr. Buhi is Assistant Professor of Law at Berry University's Dwayne O. Andreas School of Law in Orlando, Florida, in the United States. And we are very fortunate to have him here with us tonight, especially as I know it's quite early in the morning where he is. So he was quite generous to wake up early to present to us. Professor Buhi will speak for around 45 minutes. After that, we will open the floor to questions and discussion. If you have any questions during the talk, please send them in to me using the chat feature on Zoom, and I will then read them out or simply perhaps unmute you so you can pose the question yourself. The aim of this seminar, as of all of our seminars, is very much to generate questions, discussion, and so forth. So please do send in any questions you may have. And one thing that's almost always the case, especially with Zoom, is that the questions tend to come quite late in the day, towards the end of the presentation or discussion. And then, unfortunately, there often isn't a chance to pose all of them. So if you do have a question, do your best to get it in early, and then your chances of having it presented will be much higher. For everyone's information, let me observe as well that this event will be recorded and posted on the center's website. So if you want to rewatch the link or share it with colleagues or others, it will be available from perhaps a week or so following the event from our website. Without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Professor Buhi.
Thank you, Professor Roberts. Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, and I shall try to share my screen. Okay, are you seeing a PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see
it.
Okay,
I see some nodding. Thank you very much. It's good to be back in Hong Kong, even if it's virtually. I haven't been there since the summer of 2019, but prior to that, I spent 12 years with a gap in Hong Kong. And so I miss you, and I hope you're taking good care of yourselves and of each other. Thank you, Professor Roberts, for reaching out to me. Thank you to the Transnational Legal History Group, the Comparative Constitutional Law Forum, the Center for Comparative Transnational Law, all within the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Hope to see you all again in person soon someday. I'm here today to talk about my book. It's by Routledge Press, published by Routledge Press. It is called Global Constitutional Narratives of Autonomous Regions, The Constitutional History of Macau, or as I simply call it, The Constitutional History of Macau. I've never been a fan of the clunkier names. So the book looks like that. It became available in March 2021 for sale. And I'd like to talk to you about really the unique offerings that Macau has, I believe, to the understanding of constitutionalism around the world, not only locally and regionally, but also internationally. Macau is, I think for almost everybody here, Macau is a city across the Pearl River Delta from Hong Kong, about an hour by ferry, and I haven't taken the bridge yet. I understand it may be even faster if you take the bridge. Very close to each other. Again, just for anybody who may not be as familiar in the audience, here's Hong Kong and here's Macau. Both you get a size comparison and a distance comparison here, left to right. And clearly, it's very small. about 32 square kilometers of actual land mass, I think 115 square kilometers if you include the water features. Population at the moment, about 680,000 souls, the vast majority of which are ethnically Chinese. Like Hong Kong, a very high literacy rate, a very high per capita income. I read that it was 58,000 US dollars, comparatively speaking, which comes out to a purchasing power comparative rate of about 120,000 US dollars. When you take that amount of money and you put it into the Macau local setting and how much money you can buy, purchasing power parity, which is relatively phenomenal actually around the world, a very, very rich polity. 87% of the local GDP or thereabout comes from, of course, the gambling sector. And we know it to be currently constituted as a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China under a series of policies and constitutional law known as one country, two systems, 一国两制. Like Hong Kong, it's the other city or the other region that shares that significance. Macau is, and it always has been, a city of outsized constitutional significance. Despite its very small landmass, it has always been able to act as an entrepot between the Eurasian countries. So Portugal actually colonized it in the 1550s, which I'll talk about. But for a long time, long before Hong Kong was even established, 300 years before Hong Kong was established, Macau was Hong Kong to the world. Macau was China's international city, and in fact, one of the most significant open and international cities on the entire globe for centuries. It was this entrepot at the periphery of world powers. And as a result, it always needed to be able to adapt to far off events, including the rise and the fall of empires, whether they were Portuguese or Chinese. And so, as a result, organic systems of government developed there to manage the type of cross cultural conflicts that might occur in a city of mixed polities that didn't speak the same language or have the same customs. But yet, what they did have in common was this type of what we would call here maybe a Creole constitutionalism, this fusion where the city state was created that was too distant to be controlled by Lisbon, Portugal, and too useful to be assimilated by Beijing. It was just generating too much money and too much opportunity. And so Macau enjoyed de facto autonomy for a very, very, very long time, hundreds of years, an autonomy that de jure, at least, it still enjoys today. Of course, today it is most recently reconstituted as an SAR, as I was saying. As most of you know, it was returned to China 2 years after Hong Kong was. It was returned in 1999. It is I think when you look at the amount of international scholarship that's out there, that it's fair to say that it is the lesser understood, or at least the lesser examined and discussed of the two Chinese SARs. I think with the unrest in Hong Kong, it's particularly worth study. And there's some very, very influential people who may be in the audience today who have long said that from Beijing's perspective, the treatment of the two polities has always been somewhat similar. And this has resulted in a theory of what we see happening in Hong Kong may or may not be a Macauization, actually verbing the phrase Macau, hoping to see Hong Kong's institutions and polity more mirror that. And so that's a concept I'll probably talk about as well when we come to the end here. Is in fact that happening? And if so, how? So this is the outline that I'm going to go through today. I just gave you a little bit of introduction about Macau, which hopefully all of you knew. I'll tell you next a little bit about the work background, a little bit about my methodology and how this project came to be. Then I'll get into the fun stuff, the actual eras or the periodization of Macau history and Macau constitutional history as I saw it, and try to share with you an anecdote maybe of each of the different periods that I see in Macau history. What will this ultimately lead to is a view, a holistic view of Macau history vis-a-vis the Macau Basic Law. And I look at that holistic Macau history and I say, what are some things that were always there? What were some things that were there from the beginning, present from the creation, that maintain themselves through all the different periods of Macau history, whether it was pre-modern or Portuguese colonial or Chinese transitional period? What were the commonalities that had made their way into the Macau Basic Law, either because they were always there or just comparing the Hong Kong Basic Law and the Macau Basic Law, identifying differences, legal or cultural reflections that are actually there in the two documents. And that will lead to some conclusions. So I'll be honest and say that my book began as PhD research at the University of Hong Kong. I was there from 2012 until 2017 as a student. Fu Hualing and Albert Chen were my supervisors. But many, many people helped along the way, naturally, and too many people to actually thank. But in the event that any of them are here this evening or might catch the replay of this, I wanted to say special thank you to the members of my dissertation panel who were Johannes Chan, Cora Chan, and Sunny Low, and to some key figures throughout the way who were there at more interim steps or who gave really good advice when I asked for it, including Paulo Cardinal, Carmen Amado Mendez, Michael Ng, Richard Collin, Michael Davis, and many, many more. So just a brief shout out there, like they do at the Oscars, to a few people. The thesis was, and this is the thesis that carries over into the book as well, that Macau possesses this unique constitutional history, and it's underappreciated despite its potential contributions to local and national and international discourse. Simon Young published a bibliography of books on and articles on the Hong Kong Basic Law and Hong Kong constitutional development. I believe he published it in 2006, and he included in there titles that had to do with Macau. And it was about 6-to-1, the ratio, the number of works on Hong Kong vis-a-vis the number of works on Macau. And I suspect that number has only increased in recent years. Certainly it has not gone the other way. So with that said, there was a different flavor to the scholarship as well. Macau scholarship, and I think it comes from their civil law perspective. The works on Macau, don't look into the deep history. They don't look to the past very much. They don't really look much prior to 1976, which is when Macau had its previous constitution, the Organic Statute of Macau, under the Portuguese and Chinese transitional regime. You don't see a lot before that. Whereas in Hong Kong, of course, you see reference to the past, to the colonial era laws and such, all the time referenced by scholars and jurists, and then increasingly even by the government itself in recent years, when you're talking about the emergency ordinance and things like that actually being triggered in recent years in Hong Kong. So both the Hong Kong and Macau Basic Law sort of beg for this analysis because Articles 8 and 18 of the two basic laws say that the laws previously in force remain in force. But the way that the jurists and the scholars go about it, I believe, is somewhat different. And so this book aims to help fill that, I believe, Macau gap, I call it, in our understanding as comparativists by providing the first, or at least the most up-to-date, comprehensive English language treatise of Macau's constitutional history. The book is a chronological survey from before the Portuguese arrival, but in fact, it really, as far as documentation goes, an analysis of documentation, it begins with the Portuguese arrival in the 1500s, and it goes through 2020. The deadline to get the book in was August the 1st, 2020. And so as you all know, the national security law for Hong Kong, which was promulgated on July the 1st, or went into effect on July the 1st, 2020, was just there on the eve of turning this in. So while I speak a little bit about it at the end, of course, my thought on that and its impact on Macau and the region is a lot more detailed now than it is in the book. So maybe look forward to version edition 2 someday to get that into more detail. But basically, from the 1550s to 2020 is what we're talking at here. And the challenge, methodologically, of course, is that the city's Portuguese and Chinese polities were allegiant to separate political and legal hierarchies. And these two hierarchies frequently clashed for hegemony or who was in control in Macau. And so, therefore, an analysis was needed, a type of methodology was needed that could identify the fundamental documents and governance institutions of this ancient jurisdiction, respect that Macau's two main polities were allegiant to different dynasties and different fountainheads of power, and to account for the vastly different levels of constitutional entrenchment among these different communities. So, to that end, um, it's doctrinal, historical, and comparative to some degree. Doctrinal, of course, meaning we look at the black letter law, um, which is never, I believe, conclusive when we're really looking at law. We always want to see how laws operate. Particularly, we need to go deeper than that for Macau for a few reasons. First of all, it's such an ancient jurisdiction that it predates written constitutions in the world by hundreds of years. And yet, we need a definition of constitution that is therefore broad enough to encompass not only the documents, but also the repertoires of governance and how things actually worked in civil society and social movements before the modern era. The documentary approach becomes more useful as we get closer in time, because once we see the advent of written constitutions and modern bureaucratic states in the 19th century, the documents start to flow. But before that, it's more reconstructive and archival research. And this is tough because many of Macau's most important documents and archives were destroyed. They were lost when the Jesuit order was disbanded in the 1760s, when St. Paul's Church burned down in 1835, and during the Cultural Revolution riots in Macau in 1966, when legislative archives were burned in the streets. So a lot was lost. And fortunately, however, a lot more has survived than perhaps is generally known. Particularly, there are institutions in Portugal, um, national libraries and museums which are gathering these documents, and they still have entire boxes of documents which are organized by date, but they don't know exactly what those documents are. And so part of this research was getting in there and translating some of these documents. And finally, it's comparative. Not per se in the sense that I'm comparing this to, like modern Europe or modern United States or Canada or something, but in maybe three other regards. First of all, from time period to time period within Macau itself, to contrast the norms between the different eras. Second of all, comparing the Macau and Hong Kong documents in the modern era to tease out what the Macau characteristics are, at least from the perspective of Beijing and perhaps from Lisbon too, which was negotiating for those provisions and the difference in the documents. And finally, a comparison of the sources that are out there, Chinese, Portuguese being the main ones, English and French to a lesser degree. But stories, whether they're actual formal histories or they're just letters from Macau or something like that, all go into reconstructing the history of Macau. What was my aims when I was doing my PhD, my research, my questions were defining those areas of Macau history came first, and that's where I'm about to turn. Outlining the governance structures and sources of law and normative values of each era and encapsulating each era and creating a periodization that way. Trying to gauge the level of entrenchment, seeing just based on history and the events that occurred, did the constitution of that era actually serve to structure or constrain the government of the time, or were things more abstract and ad hoc? And to evaluate to what extent these characteristics, as I said, moved from era to era. Sometimes they were rejected from era to era. Sometimes they were continued consciously or subconsciously from era to era, culminating in the Macau Basic Law. So, without further ado, I'll turn to the fun section of the book here, which is the periodization and some anecdotes from different periods. I actually have 8 periods of Macau history, and they didn't fit very well on one PowerPoint slide, so I've kind of encapsulated them here a little bit. But 1553 to 1662 was when Macau was a relatively unincorporated trade outpost. And that's one area that I will talk today. I'll share a lot of anecdotes about that period as an example today. From 1623 to 1783, I call it the Democratic Citadel. This was a strange period where Macau had incorporated itself as a town hall municipality. It was under the control of a local senate. The senate was supreme. And yet, after an invasion in 1622 by the Dutch, they seek more protection. They petition Lisbon for a protector, and they get more than they bargain for because Lisbon sends a captain general and captain generals throughout the Portuguese colonial world, they were mainly prevalent in Africa and Brazil. They were there to rule under martial law as a military outpost. And so you had this friction and you had this difficult harmonization period where you had this captain general experience come in and intending to rule under martial law vis-a-vis a local senate and that already had clearly established prerogatives. And the way that China actually acts to backstop and support the local Senate in Macau and maintain the status quo is of a lot of interest in this period. It's also a period of incredible turmoil where the Ming dynasty collapses and is replaced by the Qing. And Macau loses its livelihood as a trading port between China and Japan because Japan cuts off the Macau trade or the China trade. The Portuguese crown is restored, which is not necessarily good for Macau, and I'll talk about that soon. All these things happen, and yet Macau survives. And it's the local Senate that really gets them through it because it's responsive to local interests and it's attuned and it's adaptable. We have a period of imperial consolidation, that is Portuguese imperial consolidation, beginning in the late 18th century to basically the establishment of Hong Kong, where normative values coming out of Lisbon, Lisbon now has been infected with this spirit of colonialism and this post Treaty of Westphalia idea of sovereignty. And so they begin to promulgate constitutions and documents, which, on the one hand, serve as the first constitutional law, formal written constitutional law in the modern sense, on Chinese soil. But on the other hand, are much more aggressive about asserting Portuguese sovereignty, which is a question that wasn't even really discussed before this era. It was a concept that wasn't much discussed before this era, when Macau looked more like a Portuguese and Chinese joint venture. Then we have the Portuguese colonial era. In my book, I actually separated into three eras: early, middle, and late. And I'll talk briefly about the difference between those three. And then we have the transitional era, 1967 to 1999, where I assert that the PRC was largely in charge. And I'll return to that theme shortly. And then, of course, we're in the SAR era today. So if we break down the Portuguese colonial era into thirds and we add the SAR era, we've got 8. And we all know that the SAR era has an expiration date. We can't ignore that in the documents. So from 2049 on, we're going to be looking perhaps at a 9th era of Macau constitutional history. So not only are there these 8 eras, but I think that they can be broadly combined into these kind of epochs here. And I think that there's a pre-colonial era, I want to call it that, where this is more of a joint venture, where scholars both uh, uh, Chinese modern scholars, both Chinese and Portuguese and foreign, have referred to this era as an era of shared sovereignty. Again, it's a little bit quaint and naive in the modern perspective, but we're talking about the 1500s here, before the Treaty of Westphalia once again kind of gives us this modern notion of borders and nation states. Um, so three of these, I think, plug into this pre-colonial era well, when it's more of a joint venture, cooperative joint venture. Then, of course, we do have what I think is a hard colonial era, where on the coattails of the British naval supremacy in Hong Kong, the Portuguese are finally able to impose their will, not only normatively, but deeper on Macau during this colonial era. And then we have this transitional slash perhaps post-colonial era, which is going to be the transitional era itself, the handover period, the SAR period, and whatever follows. Also another way of conceptualizing here. So Macau, in its original geographic format, looked like this, almost recognizable today. There was the Macau Peninsula, which was attached to Guangdong province by a 2 kilometer long stalk that has been compared to the stalk of a lotus. It had no arable land. It was mountainous at the tips of what it had. It was fortuitous for both the Chinese and the Portuguese. The Portuguese liked it because it had potable water, and also because to them there were 4 islands here, which now no longer exist. This is Taipa and Colonial. They've been reclaimed and combined really into one large area, as Hengqin Island and such have here as well. So unrecognizable. But at the time, you had this flowing cross current of water here that the Portuguese, with their Catholic religious influence, actually believed was in the shape of a cross. And so it boded very well for them, very auspiciously for them. Meanwhile, from the Chinese perspective, this was a very, very defensible position. There was really no way that any type of aggression could be mounted against the Chinese mainland from here, given the fact that there was no arable land, given the fact that any army would have to either do a water landing into modern day Buhi or cross this peninsula, where the Chinese authorities very early on erected a gate. And I'll tell you an anecdote here about the first time they closed the gate and basically starved Macau's authorities into submission, which they did many, many times during the early era. Whenever Portuguese would send a new governor who would try to assert the Portuguese prerogatives and violate the status quo of the joint venture agreement, they would do that. And once again, reassert Chinese hegemony until they went knocking on the door, hat in hand, getting them to open the gate again and reverting back to the way things were. So the first era I call the Entrepot of Eurasia, 1553 to 1662. This is where the Portuguese first arrive in the region. There's evidence of human activity in Macau from the 2nd century before the Common Era, but really the modern permanent settlement appears to begin in the 1270s when refugees from the southern Song dynasty go there. Not long after that, a Fujian merchant community establishes itself in the south at the Bara. Legend has it that they were saved at sea by the goddess Ama, from which Macau gets its name, Macau, the modern transliteration of Macau. It's sparsely populated and loosely administered, if at all, during certain periods of Chinese history, until the Portuguese arrive in the 1550s. This is a multiple generational journey. They don't have the power to cross Europe. They don't have the military force with all the things going on there. So they look for a sea passage route, and they go around Africa and around the Middle East, and they eventually arrive at Macau. They first arrive in 1521, but news of their bad conduct, alleged bad conduct at Malacca when they take over there, the final major destination before Macau, reaches Beijing ahead of them. And so as a result, the very first Portuguese diplomatic mission to Beijing is captured. They actually die in captivity. They're arrested. Um, The Portuguese kind of flounder at sea. They try to make some headway in Taiwan. They return in 1549 under an experienced captain named Lionel de Souza. And he agrees to a trade agreement with a local bureaucrat. And this trade agreement is actually kept secret for a couple decades because the bureaucrat there is actually pocketing it sort of as a bribe, sort of as a personal bribe, saying, oh, my superiors know about this, but they actually didn't. And so as a result, you had Chinese nationalists, Ming nationalists at the time, who often would try to burn down the Portuguese establishment at Macau because they believed that they were doing the right thing. They thought that this was a trespass. Years later, actually, the Portuguese, I think they get smart to it. And they try to pay the local bureaucrat, the local Ming bureaucrat, at a formal event that's open to the public, at which point he's forced to acknowledge that this has been going on for some time. And the message finally goes to higher authorities that this has been agreed to. But they come to the terms, this Portuguese admiral or captain and this deputy commissioner of Guangdong province customs. And they don't exchange a formal document, but the Portuguese captain writes, I think, an honest description of what it is because he admits what he got and what he did not get, what he failed to get. And I've never seen a Chinese translation of anything that disputes it. In fact, I've seen Chinese literature that refers to the document not in so much detail, but acknowledges it. And the terms of this were that the current Portuguese were going to renounce any association with their former cohorts that arrived there a couple decades before. They agreed to pay a 20% customs tax for any business that they did at Macau. And they did a lot of business because they were the middlemen for a while, middle people between China and Japan who were not getting along and not directly trading with each other. So Portuguese would carry the silks and the teas from Guangzhou to Japan in exchange for Japanese silver. And this is how they made rich for 40 years or so. And they gained permission to trade at Guangzhou. On the other hand, the Portuguese captain said, I wanted a reduced tax rate. I bargained for a 10% tax rate, a most favored nation status. He failed to get it. And he failed to get the release of the remaining Portuguese prisoners held at Guangzhou. The unspoken term was this payment of land rent, as it became to be known to the local bureaucrat. And I told you that anecdote there. So let's see here. Of course, from the Portuguese perspective, we have see quick development during this time period from a random outpost to in 1557, it falls under the direct command of the captain major of the Japan voyage. It was this trip from Goa in India to Nagasaki, Japan, this trade voyage. And so now Macau is officially on the map, which basically makes it a recognized a Portuguese trading outpost. As such, it comes under the direct command of this captain general. Whenever he was actually present in Macau, he was there. And if he wasn't there, then a local land captain would manage the events. Portugal gets absorbed by Spain during this time period because the Portuguese king dies on a crusade and he does not have an heir. So as a result, Portugal gets annexed. And there is a treaty of autonomy between Spain and Portugal known as the Cortes de Tomar. And it essentially says, among other things, that Portugal can maintain her colonies. Spain will not interfere in Portuguese colonies, believe it or not, so long as those colonies are incorporated. So when word that Portugal has fallen to Spain arrives to the authorities in Macau, they immediately call a general assembly, direct democracy. Everybody in the city that was capable of voting, about 800 people, of course, they're going to be the white males, Portuguese, form this general conclave. And it's led by the local land captain and the local religious prelates, because Macau is also going to be the head of the Catholic diocese for all of East Asia at this time. And they quickly act without any prerogative from above to incorporate themselves as a town hall municipality. They agree on the spot, we're going to create a Senate with 6 elected officials and all the other accoutrements that are going to come along with this. And the Spanish king, King Philip, has no choice but to recognize it post facto in 1586. And he will then, as will his Portuguese successors when the crown is restored, try over and over and over again to assert crown authority, crown hegemony over Macau, but it's just too far away. And these people that have inhabited there, they're not nice people. I don't mean to say they're not nice, but they're not, let's say they're not docile people. Maybe some of them were nice. I don't know. Although they brought on a tremendous amount of they certainly brought a tremendous amount of slaves with them, which, to say the least, was not a nice thing to do, to say the least. Right? They're members of the original foundation of Macau here as well, building of many of these institutions. With that said, they try to assert hegemony over it over and over and over again, and they fail, really. It's not really until the establishment of British Hong Kong that that's actually able to happen, really on the coattails of British naval supremacy, not because the Portuguese themselves ever had the power to do it. Meanwhile, what does the Ming dynasty do when they learn about this? It's a subdued response. There's not much resistance on the Chinese side to the new Senate or what happens in this barbarian colony on the coast of China. They do get summoned to the local Ming Dynasty outpost there across the border. The Portuguese are summoned, they send a delegation. And there's evidence of a bribe, both in the Portuguese and the Chinese literature, of about the equivalent of 1,000 gold coins is paid. And once that happens, there's a statement made, well, Macau can keep going its own way so long as it finally recognizes Chinese sovereignty or Chinese authority, sovereignty not really being articulated at the time. So what the Chinese do is they build the siege gates, which I talked about. They install local administrators below the siege gate. They at a place called Mongha, a mountain in the north of Macau. They send a Shangshan district magistrate, which is the local county magistracy of the Ming dynasty in Guangzhou and Zhuhai region there. They divide the city into the Fanfang governance system, where the streets are blocked off according to, like metric numbers and such to keep tabs on the population. And the one member of the Portuguese Senate, who's a very, very interesting member, named the Procurador, actually gets recruited and is given a rank as a low-level Chinese official. So this person is the natural go-between between the Portuguese establishment and the Chinese establishment. And this continues for some time, but the era really presents the foundations of an ad hoc constitutional order where there is a Portuguese-Chinese joint venture. The Portuguese clearly could have been evicted any time by the Chinese authorities if they wanted to, and they didn't. Same is true for the next era. I discussed it here. The Dutch try to invade in 1622. The Jesuits, with their fortress there, if you've ever been to the mountain fortress in Macau, that's actually built by the Jesuits, a Catholic sect, and they get very, very lucky because the Macau authorities are actually in Beijing. The Macau people are very good at building cannons, and they build the best cannons in the world at this time, and the Chinese are supplying the best gunpowder in the world at this time. So it's a natural fusion. And the Portuguese have taken their best cannon and their best cannon operators to Beijing to show the imperial authorities how to defend the Ming dynasty against the Manchu invasion, which is occurring at this time. So there's only a skeleton force remaining in Macau when 800 Hollanders land, and they land north of the colony between the Portuguese village and the Chinese border. And so the Portuguese have to turn their cannons around, and they fire a cannonball that gets very, very lucky and destroys the powder magazine of the Hollanders and sends them into disarray. And the Portuguese are able to win. But as a result of this, they ask for a protector. And they get this general who comes expecting to lead the colony under martial law. And he comes in and he basically disbands the Senate. Actually, the Jesuits try to assassinate him. The second time that these cannons are fired in anger, they fire at his residence, trying to kill him. He eventually is able to use subterfuge to attract the Jesuits out of their mountain fortress and get his forces in, and he takes it over, and it becomes the residence of the Macau governors for hundreds of years that follow. But he tries essentially to, dictate things to the Chinese community there for the first time and impose a regime change on the way things were. And all that happens is the Chinese Ming authorities shut the siege gates and remind him who controls the land. And once the population begins to starve, it's the first of several times he goes hat in hand to the door, actually, the procurador in the Senate, hat in hand saying, hey, we got the situation under control now, open up. And so the Chinese backstop the Portuguese senatorial presence and the legislative supremacy in the system all throughout this time period. I've got to speed up a little bit with time. Let me just hit some highlights here. Of course, this is a period of Portuguese restoration, loss of the Japan trade, fall of the Ming dynasty, sends Macau into disarray in the middle of this period. And I believe that if the Ming had been stronger, if the Ming themselves were not on the verge of collapse, and in fact did collapse to the Qing, they probably would have evicted chaotic Portuguese from Macau at this time. But the Macau people were still providing cannons and logistical support to the Ming, even the late Ming dynasty, as it was falling back to Guilin in its final vestigial phases. And so as a result, um, it's allowed to stay. And the Qing, they get back to their proper footing by the time the Qing really can assert control over the area, really get control of Guangzhou and Guangdong. And so they continue paying land rent and the situation moves forward. In the age of imperial consolidation, we see a restless Lisbon now with constitutions and modern notions of sovereignty, trying to tighten control, but once again, basically the same pattern plays out. Lisbon sends a governor, the governor tries to raise some Chinese settlements and impose law on the Chinese community. The Chinese, for their part, close the siege gate. The same thing happens as happened before. Toward the end of the era, the British are largely in charge of Macau. They own all the best real estate. The British East India Company is there, and they're large and they're in charge. They get evicted, of course, on the eve of the Opium War. The Portuguese back the Chinese in evicting the British when the order comes down from Lin Chezu, the commissioner in charge. They're going to land at Hong Kong. And when that happens, it finally provides the strength that Lisbon needed to impose its colonial vision on Macau. They send a one-armed strongman named Governor Amaral to impose strict authority, strict Portuguese authority over Macau. And he does. He destroys all the symbols of Chinese sovereignty. He claims the siege gate, goes to the siege gate, claims it, ceases the land rent payments, imposes Portuguese taxation on the Chinese citizens, closes the Chinese customs houses, expels the Chinese magistracy, and he's assassinated actually by Chinese interests during this time period. But what he did was backed by the British. British sent gunboats from Hong Kong and supported it. It ends on the eve of the Portuguese and the Chinese Republican revolutions. Okay, both 1910 and 1911, there's these Republican revolutions. But in both countries, as we know, these revolutions are doomed to fail. The Portuguese constitution of the time grants a relatively high amount of local control over the colonies, a decentralization regime. But in 1920, the Portuguese president is assassinated, and this is after World War I. It's kind of an anarchy situation. And so as a result, Portugal goes down the road to militancy once again. And we know the same thing happened in China, of course, a Republican experiment, frustrated under Sun Yat-sen, who, of course, did his training and his early work in Macau, frustrated by Yuan Shikai in the first place, and then later on by the Japanese invasion and the struggles between Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communist Party in the later 1920s. Then we get this late colonial period from the 1930s to 1966, which is where the authorities of both countries, again, are on a wartime footing, a very, very militant footing. The Portuguese government becomes a fascist government known as the New State or the Estado Novo. And of course, we have the Chinese Civil War with the backdrop of the Japanese invasion in the first place. Macau is able to maintain some autonomy during this period. The Japanese secret police and such are in charge of Macau, and they strip it of its valuable items. But at the same time, it's never outwardly invaded. Portugal's officially neutral during World War II, so it's a place of spy networks and intrigue, where the Japanese are truly in charge, but never does the Japanese flag fly, so to speak. The population of Macau during this period also swells from 200,000 people to upwards of 1 million people, taking in refugees in a very short time period. The handover era, well, what happens? 1949, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is triumphant. Immediately, the Chinese, the CCP Common Program, the 1954 Constitution, a united front project begins in Macau behind the scenes. By 1966, when the Cultural Revolution is in full swing, there's a riot in Macau known as the 123 incident that began over building permits for a Chinese language and Chinese nationalist school. Permits were denied. A riot starts, a protest starts. A Portuguese police officer fires into the crowd, I believe, killing a Chinese, which starts this larger protests, which bring the colonial government of Macau to its knees. And from that moment forward, the Portuguese governments really focused on the Portuguese population, and the Chinese United Front and the Kaifeng associations are in charge of the Chinese population, in one way smoothing the handover to ultimate Chinese rule, but of course in the vacuum, the triads, and there's a lot of gangland violence filling the vacuum, of course, between the two spheres in the period as well. Portugal has a revolution in 1974 itself called the Carnation Revolution. It ends the fascist government of Portugal. They try to leave. They actually leave all of their colonies around the world overnight, just a cold exit from everywhere except Macau. And the reason is Beijing actually asked them to stay and said, we want Hong Kong and Macau back together. We're afraid of the impact this is going to have on the future reclamation of Hong Kong. And so we request you stay. So a special form of government was created for Macau to maintain this handover for another 25 years. Of course, during this period, this is where we see the functional constituency system, which we're familiar with from the Hong Kong LegCo. It was in Macau during this Estrada Nova regime. I'll skip ahead here to the SAR. Of course, we have the handover in 1999, the imposition of the Basic Law, the National Security Law. There's a lot of constitutional documents floating around that go into the drafting of the Basic Law, from the 76 Portuguese Constitution and Organic Charter of Macau to a secret treaty signed between Beijing and Lisbon, which was denied for many years, known as the Secret Act, the PRC State Constitution and CCP Constitutions, and the Sino-Portuguese Joint Declaration. The drafting process looks very, very similar to the Hong Kong drafting process. It's later in time, but it's modeled on Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Basic Law is used as a template. Basically, thematically, it looks the same, but I identify 14 differences between the two documents, which were, of course, were points of negotiation between the two regimes. Private land ownership, the continuation of a civil law legal system. We see as a result of that, I believe, a deeper codification of rights, actually things written into the Basic Law like habeas corpus and no death penalty and no post ex facto application of law, which are missing from the Hong Kong Basic Law, probably because it was thought that the common law system would protect these things. We see recognition of European human dignity jurisprudence, deeper provisions on Portuguese cultural interests, residency and nationality, provisions against corruption, extended welfare provisions, a duty to protect the environment, continuation of this office of the procurador, which is no longer what it once was under the Macau Colonial era. Now it's more a prosecutor. Lawmaking by decree, the chief executive can still do formally in Macau. The continuation of chief executive appointed seats in the legislature. which was not a thing in Macau in Hong Kong until at least very recently. If we see the new reform and we see the new section of election committee seats which are coming our way, and we can analogize them to that section of that third of the Macau Legislative Assembly, which again goes back to this theme of Macauization, which other scholars like Sunny Low have spoken about, and the fact that aspirations for political reform are missing from the Macau Basic Law. There's nothing there about an ultimate aim of universal suffrage or anything like that. The Portuguese, when they left, were more insistent upon granting right of abode and Portuguese passports to anybody that qualified, but they didn't have any ambition to kind of govern the situation or surveil the situation in Macau after the handover. In fact, they wanted out in 1974. So they were quite happy to wash their hands of any future aspirations, so long as the people they considered to be Portuguese nationals received their passports. And maybe that has a lot to do with the difference between the two polities today and how they've changed under the law. So I'll try to wrap up here in about a minute because I know I'm a little bit over time on the lecture part. But I do conclude that the Macau Basic Law does reflect Macau characteristics in six main ways. There is an outsized constitutional dignity to Macau. Even though it's so small, it still continues to operate as this open door between East and West, if we still want to use those terms, this international open door, both in terms of scholarship and cultural exchanges and trade as a free port and money exchanges and the casinos and the joint ventures, but also as a receptacle of international norms under the ICCPR, essentially, which is recognized in the Macau Basic Law. This economic autonomy is still granted today, but it's still a monopoly. Macau goes through these monopoly periods where the monopoly was trade with Japan, and then it was spices from East India. Then for a while it was opium when it was on the coattails of Hong Kong. Today, of course, gambling. Cultural diversity still here today. It's recognized in provisions that speak to preserving cultural heritage there, both historical sites and religious communication and such of that nature. Charity. The Macau Portuguese were very, very charitable. And you can go to the central square there in Macau, the Senado Square, and you'll be surrounded by institutions that were financed by the Senate, which were charitable institutions, like the Santa Casa de Misericordia, which ran a leprosarium and orphanage and things like that for many, many times, and hospitals that were open to indigent people, whether they were Chinese or Portuguese. There was always corruption there, from the very payment of land rent to the beginning to the Chinese authority through the final Portuguese administrations. A couple of those final administrations were toppled because of local corruption. And so we see deeper provisions in the Macau Basic Law than the Hong Kong Basic Law. Things like the Macau chief executive cannot go into business for himself. Things that seem commonsensical but are not in the Hong Kong Basic Law. And finally, of course, ultimate Chinese control. Although I think the very first lines of the preamble of the Macau Basic Law, which reads very similar to the preamble of the Hong Kong Basic Law, basically saying that this is a community that was a colony that fell under Western hegemony from the certain time period that they arrived. I don't think that really sums it up. I think while that's true in the case of Hong Kong was undoubtedly a military conquest of the British Navy. I don't think we can say the same thing for Macau for at least its first 300 years of history, and that's quite significant, that it was a joint venture. Although it was always under Chinese hegemony and control, it was a joint venture. The one thing that I think fails, of course, from the traditional Macau perspective when we look at that time period is the adaptability to political situation. For hundreds of years, 300 years, Macau was under the control of a local Senate. The Senate was the negotiator between the Chinese authority and the Portuguese authority, and had that officer that could go back and be the ambassador between the two sides. And it could adapt to the real situation on the ground, whether it was British invasions of Macau, which happened, or other things, and solve the situation. What we have instead, of course, is a sort of ossified or continued political system that looks very much like it did during the Salazar regime of the Estado Novo, with the corporatist political structure, essentially. That has never changed. That survived Salazar, it survived the Portuguese Republic, and it's continued today into this era. And of course, now we're seeing that carried over, maybe more and more the Macaoization of Hong Kong with that. So there's so much I could talk about, especially about so many issues moving forward. But I want to open the floor. I want to return it back to Professor Roberts. I suppose he'll want to open the floor, and hopefully I'll get the chance to do that with your questions. So I thank you for your time this morning, and I look forward to more discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Professor Buhi, for that fascinating presentation. It was clear going through how much more, how many details from so many different historical periods there were that we could have drilled, I'm sure, drilled down on further, and doubtless we'll have a chance to drill down on some of them in the discussion. So let me just, as I said at the beginning, I know it's always, I think more difficult to compose questions and send them in writing than it is in person, but please, if those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please do send them in to me now, and I will pose them. But I will take advantage of the speakers, the moderator's prerogative to begin by posing a couple questions of my own, which are sort of, I suppose, probably on the more historically interested side of the spectrum. So the first one is just perhaps if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between the Portuguese in Macau and the British, and in particular, how you would, in that kind of long, I can't remember if you called it sort of high imperial phase from around, the 1840s to the 1960s, sort of how you see the differences in those two empires in terms of how they approached Hong Kong and Macau, or just imperial governance in general. And perhaps also if you could say a bit more about the Senate you were mentioning that developed in Macau, and in particular, to what extent, I mean, just the fact that you used, that it's referred to as a Senate suggests a certain sort of historical legacy and imagination. But I was wondering, to what extent that was kind of what the ideational and situational origins of that were, to what extent sort of it was coming from a European tradition, to what extent it was rooted in the particular local context of Macau, etc. So those are two questions we can start off with, and once again, let me encourage the audience to send in your questions.
Thank you. Should I respond to that now?
Please.
Okay. Thank you for the really good questions, and thank you for paying attention and isolating those. The relationship between the Macau Portuguese and the British is an interesting one. Macau, that was when it was formed, when Portugal and Spain dominated the high seas, and Spain went the other way. The Vatican actually said, Spain go that way, Portugal go that way, so there wouldn't be any complication between them. The Pope in Rome drew a line down the known map of the world, which sent the Spanish around South America and ultimately to the Philippines, and the Portuguese around Africa and the Middle East, and ultimately to Macau. And that's where the interests finally collide between the two. And so they go back and forth for a while, especially during the conquest of Portugal. But when the Portuguese crown is restored, history has turned the page. And it's no longer Catholic naval power, which is supreme in the world. It's Protestant naval power, led by the Dutch originally. And the Dutch kind of went after the Portuguese possessions, which were few and far between around the world, these outposts just scattered throughout Africa and the Middle East, and just start cleaning them up. And so when that happens, Macau becomes isolated and it has to stand on its own, and it can no longer communicate really back to Lisbon or count on Lisbon for any supply or requisitioning or anything like that. So this goes a little bit toward the theory of the Senate, which is your second question, that the people in Macau become very fiercely independent and they become very proud of being Macanese, so to speak, that they're doing this on their own. And so, to a certain degree, a certain loyalty to the Chinese benefactors, which are supporting them there, develops as well. Um, but originally, it's the Dutch, and the British kind of lie low and kind of go on the Dutch coattails until they rise in prominence after the Dutch are defeated at certain episodes around the world, including a couple invasions of Macau, and then the British are assertive. And from the very, very beginning, the Chinese were very suspicious of the British. And they were suspicious of them because when the Dutch came, they were very, very aggressive, more aggressive than the Portuguese had been, about probing up the Pearl River, getting to Guangzhou, raising settlements on the way. So the Chinese actually referred to the British and the Dutch together as red-haired barbarians. And they said, don't allow the red-haired barbarians in Macau, or we will punish you. We'll close the siege gates and punish you if you harbor them, if you give them any kind of respite there. So eventually they start sneaking in. They really arrive in force in the late 1700s. At this time, China in the Qing, early to mid Qing under the Yongzheng Emperor and such, is relatively open to the world as far as trade goes. Maybe they didn't know all the history that the Ming had with the British and the Dutch, and so they're open to that. Another thing is Beijing at the time doesn't allow diplomatic establishments in Beijing. You're not allowed to go to Beijing. And so Macau is actually the embassy row. A part of Macau now, which is close to where the Macau Tower is, that's reclaimed land. But that used to be a big beach. And along that big beach was all of China's foreign embassies at the time period. Um, so at this time period, the British work their way in. They get stronger and stronger. Where the Protestant cemetery is, that's a Protestant cemetery because it is the British cemetery of the British East India Company, which controlled really all the de facto good real estate and good economy assets of Macau at the time. And so they're dictating things. They're doing the opium trade. They're really managing everything at Macau by the turn of the 19th century. And moving forward, even though the Portuguese expel them on the orders of the Chinese, and they do so because they said, we're going to invade you, we'll kick you out if you don't kick them out. The British were not happy about that at all. They didn't like being dictated down to by what they considered to be an inferior power, being the Portuguese, and the Portuguese taking the side of a I suppose, European power against them. So they were very bitter about this. But an interesting thing happens in the mid 1880s. And what happens is the French actually offer to exchange land in Africa in exchange with Portugal in exchange for Macau. And Macau and Portugal resist, but the Britain gets wind of it and it spooks them because they don't want a French presence right on their doorstep in Hong Kong. So what they do is they help the Portuguese, actually. Robert Hart and others help the Portuguese negotiate what they always wanted, which was a treaty with Beijing, which recognized perpetual sovereignty over Macau for the Portuguese. And so it's actually Robert Hart and the British Foreign Service that write and draft this 1887 Treaty of Peking on behalf of the Portuguese, which is going to recognize Portuguese sovereignty over Macau. And of course, from the Chinese perspective, they say it's an unequal treaty naturally. And they say it further proves our claim to sovereignty because it says Portugal was not allowed to alienate the land because we agreed with them that they're not able to alienate the land in this treaty without our approval. So therefore, even though we say they're sovereign, we really preserve sovereignty over the area, and it became a very interesting thing. The Senate, the origins of which come from the European continental town hall municipality tradition, that city-states would develop themselves. Portugal's original commission in 1586 looks like the city of Evora in Portugal. It was granted a 6-member Senate, including 3 aldermen, 2 lay judges, and the procurador, which of course is going to be a special position in Macau, not just a a simple bureaucrat, but this ambassadorial go-between between the two. In fact, becomes a Chinese low-level official. So not only is the Senate truly in charge of Macau because Macau is isolated, the imperial authorities from Lisbon, they'll get a governor through every once in a while, but they can't conduct day-to-day affairs in Macau. It's the Senate that's conducting things day-to-day for hundreds of years with this go-between going between the two polities. And so I suggest that this is a Creole constitutionalism that was unique in the constitutional empire of Portugal. It was unique in the Chinese constitutional empire itself. It was unique in the world. And it showed a way to govern land that, there was not at that time, a really strong modern argument of sovereignty to. We weren't so concerned about that as we were about a joint venture. And maybe it's naive in the modern world to look at that and say it could work, but maybe I'm being imaginative now, but why not? Why not if both sides agree? It's something that has been lost to history or is in danger of being lost. And I hope that I'm recording it well in this book.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for the great answers. So we've really got a bunch of questions coming in now. So maybe I'll share a few with you because I think there are numerous ways that they interrelate. So I'll give you 3 or 4, but if you forget, which I'm sure I would do if given so many questions, just feel free to ask me again. So one is, how does Portuguese constitutional law and practice of constitutional review impact on Macau's constitutional review? Another one is about British, to what extent, once again, relative to the British, to what extent was there a British influence on Macau's constitutional history? Another one, probably relating in many ways, concerns functional constituencies, and how does that feature in particular differ in Macau as opposed to Hong Kong, and were there elements of that during the pre-handover era of functional constituencies? And finally, once again in this cluster of sort of Portugal, Britain, Hong Kong, Macau comparison, the question is emphasizes that Macau tends to emphasize its linkage with Portuguese-speaking countries, and that emphasis is very iconic in comparison to Hong Kong, which doesn't tend to emphasize its relationship with Commonwealth nations. This is from the question. So the questioner posits that and then says, what is the reason behind this? And in the area of law, how does it work in terms of Macau and other former Portuguese colonies like Brazil, etc.?
Okay, thank you for a wonderful set of questions. And I'm really grateful that none of you were like, talk about provision 10 of the Additional Act of 1852 or something like that, which was a little bit my fear coming in here. Very, very good questions. First one, how do Portuguese constitutional law and practice of constitutional review impact Macau constitutional review? Okay, interesting question. If you were to ask a Portuguese scholar up until like the very modern era about constitutional review and the impact of case law and judicial review of lower level statutes and administrative rules, they would have a very difficult time understanding the question. And I don't want to name names, but I actually asked, experts in Portuguese law, Portuguese people, experts in their law, and I said, can you talk to me? Because this is something Johannes Chan asked me, and Cora Chan and Sunny Lowe asked me at my dissertation panel, something I had to go back and look at. They asked that exact same question. So whoever asked that question, very, very, very good question. And I had to go back and I had to say, I had to admit on the spot that I don't see a lot of it, but let me go back and square the circle and find out what I can find. And I talked to these scholars and they said, we have very little idea, to paraphrase, we have very little idea what you're talking about. During the colonial era, Portugal is a civil law system. and it was a hard civil law system. I mean, it was whatever came from Portugal was the universal law to be applied all throughout the Portuguese Empire. They were very much like the British, I'm sorry, the French colonial model, which was, you know, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, right? Like everything that emanates from Paris is universally good and applies equally and universally well everywhere, no matter what the context. Lisbon was influenced by that aspect of the French Revolution. And so they don't have judicial review. They don't have, like the Americans, or even to a lesser degree the British, the ability of judges to overturn statutes. Statutory law is primary in the Portuguese system. Um, and so there's very little practice of it during the colonial era. With that said, when the Portuguese promulgate their first constitution in 1822, and it contains what we would consider human rights provisions and stuff that all Portuguese are entitled to, because the Portuguese came from that French revolutionary tradition, they also considered people born in Macau to be Portuguese residents, to be full-blooded Portuguese. And so anybody of Chinese descent who was in Macau, of course, could benefit from these rights provisions as well. Everybody had equal standing as far as that went. So in effect, the Portuguese Constitution of 1822 is not to make too much of it, but it is, in a sense, the very first written constitution to be effective on Chinese soil, although on a very small appendage of Chinese soil. When the time for the transition comes around, the Portuguese judiciary is not nearly as developed as the judiciary in British Hong Kong. And so one thing that the Portuguese had to work on very, very hard in the transitional era was to create a local court structure. Okay, Portuguese cases were still pretty much going back to regional authorities and back to Lisbon, actually, basically until the very end. And so the creation of a Macau Court of Final Appeals, an intermediate branch, and everything above the courts of first instance in Macau is kind of an 11th hour project. And one of the major differences between the Portuguese colonial era and the modern era. Of course, the Macau Court of Final Appeals has the same endowments as the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeals today. So this is new to them. This was something that the Macau and the British experience in Hong Kong, grafted upon Macau. And I'm going to talk, when I answer another question about the functional constituencies, it goes the other way. The functional constituencies are something from Macau that gets grafted upon Hong Kong, actually during the negotiation and the handover process. So there's some mere reflection there. The second question is, to what extent is British influence on Macau constitutional history? Well, most importantly, it was the whole colonial era. And the Portuguese colonial era the hard, high colonial era from the 1840s until the 1960s, I don't believe ever would have occurred if the British had never taken over Hong Kong and the British Navy were there. I think it would have continued very much the way that it always had been. And where would that put us today? Today, could we possibly still have a joint venture between China and Macau? Could Macau, in the pre-colonial sense, still exist? It's very doubtful in 2021. Probably organically, some other means would have ended that. But it's fun to think about. The British, of course, and the Portuguese establishing a colony there that looks very much like British Hong Kong moving forward, and is backstopped by British naval power at Hong Kong, destroys the old contract, destroys the old joint venture, puts it on colonial footing. And I think in many ways it dooms modern Macau to be handed over rather unceremoniously, the way it was in 1999, as kind of in parity with Hong Kong. But that colonial constitution changed everything. Once again, there's a dialectical thing here where, because the British set up a colony at Hong Kong, which is executive run, we know the executive run system because that is the most easy from bureaucratic colonial rationality to govern. They do the same thing at Macau. The Senate is finally shut in Macau after 300 years A Portuguese governor from now on is going to be appointed. The municipal councils are going to come back, but they're going to be the legislature is going to come back, but only as a municipal council. Um, and so this impact is tremendous, and it can't be understated. It's going to turn it into an area that looks a lot like Britain in the sense it's executive led, and there's going to be what kind of looks like a common law judiciary today, in keeping with the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, also in Macau. Now, to this, now I said the third question, functional constituencies, and how does that factor in, and how does it differ? Again, dialectically, that comes from Macau and Portugal and goes to Hong Kong. The Salazar regime, the Estado Novo in Portugal, is interesting for a lot of reasons. But one of them is it's the very first corporatist constitutional country in the world. And what I mean by that is Salazar did not believe in direct democracy. He did not believe in universal suffrage. He believed political scientists should look at society and say, you have functional constituencies. You have groups of people that you can organize by trade. And where did he get that idea? From the Vatican. The Vatican during this time period, during the handover between the 19th and the 20th century, the Vatican was looking at the struggle between international communism and capitalism, and it didn't like, atheistic communism or greedy capitalism. And it said there has to be a middle way, and we can offer something, a middle way to the world. And so Catholic social thought at this time period was, let's create things based on the monastic guild system of the Middle Ages, the glory time to the Catholic Church, where these monastic associations would represent people rather than the people represent themselves. And this will harmonize the ideological differences. So Salazar took that manifesto and he applied it. And he said, let's divide society into lawyers and educators and real estate developers and the church and whatever. And let's have them vote as blocks to kind of temper universal suffrage and temper the will of the people. And so this gets installed in Portugal in the 1930s. All throughout the Portuguese Empire, it gets sent out, distributed to the Portuguese colonies, including Macau. And so Macau in the 1940s, 50s, 60s have variations of this functional constituency system. And I talk about all the different ways that those functional constituencies are reimagined during the period in this book. They are a little bit different than Hong Kong's, because in Macau, in the modern era, they still exist, but we associate them with like the Kaifeng associations or the Fujian community. They tend to be more ethnically based, or the Kaifeng association, community service based. In Hong Kong, of course, we know the sectors of the election committee and such like that. They have a little bit more of a political sciencey feel. But the thing is, there was never a legislative council in Hong Kong until 1985. And when, there had been one in Macau for 300 years, and then it was dissolved. And then it comes back in 1917 or so, 1930s, as this functional constituency system reimagined. Never had there been one in Hong Kong until 85. And what does it come with? Functional constituencies, which was never in British political science or thought anywhere. So I don't have a smoking gun that proves, I've never found a document that proves that they actually copied Macau, but how could they not have? Where did they get this idea? And they were comfortable with it. Of course, the Chinese authorities were comfortable with it because they saw the way it operated in Macau, and they said, we can handle that, and it seems relatively safe. And it gets transplanted to Hong Kong. So a dialectical transfer there. And the final question was Macau's emphasis on the Portuguese-speaking countries and their sense of community, and not so much in Hong Kong and the British with the Commonwealth. Okay, I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think toward the end of the Portuguese administration, they were really governing their own community, but they were looking for legacy projects. So they built that first Macau type of friendship bridge there, which is actually the bridge that was pictured there. They build the airport, things that they want to be infrastructure legacy projects, but they're not focused on schools or education or language instruction or anything like that, or political development the way the British were. A few infrastructure projects and really emphasizing Portuguese proud cultural heritage. Let's get these provisions in the Basic Law that protect our language and our historical sites. I think part and parcel of that was let's emphasize the sense of community between the Portuguese-speaking world. I think modern Lisbon's very interested in that. They're interested in that because I think they're a little bit ashamed of the way they left their empire in 1974. They left it cold turkey. They walked away overnight, everywhere but Macau. And it was catastrophic in a lot of places. Angola, Mozambique, they fall into civil war, East Timor, situations that are unresolved to this day. And so I think that there's a lot of guilt, I want to say, on behalf of the way that played out. And so there is a sense of community orchestrated by Lisbon between the Portuguese-speaking world. And I think for Chinese interests, for Macau being a free port, Macau being a trade area, that's very attractive to China to continue that legacy, especially when we look at the Belt and Road Initiative and we say, where were the Portuguese colonies? The Middle East, Africa. Where's the Belt and Road focus on? The Middle East, Africa. So there's a lot of positives there to keeping this loose confederation of Portuguese-speaking entities built around Macau. And we occasionally even see conferences of the Portuguese-speaking world being held in Macau. So I think there's a lot to say that the Macau government and the Chinese government also recognize the value here as well. Why the Hong Kong government not so much with the Commonwealth? Maybe a separate question. I think that probably there's not as much interest in the Hong Kong government, for that, or the Chinese government for that, especially in the very recent years. While on the other hand, Hong Kong kind of enjoys the economic benefits, or long enjoyed the economic benefits anyway. So there was no need to build this kind of coalition around English-speaking or Commonwealth countries. Rather, I think the Hong Kong government would prefer less surveillance from the international community while keeping the economic benefits it already has. And so there just hasn't been as much focus on that. Whereas Macau needs to redefine itself. Macau needs something beyond the casinos. And so I think the government's receptive to the Portuguese community thing.
Okay, thanks so much for those answers. You did a fantastic job of keeping all of the questions straight, and I mean, truly fascinating stuff, especially on all of it. But I think the corporatism observations are incredibly interesting and compelling, and I'd love to hear. We could discuss that all night. I think that's fascinating stuff. So I have a few another round of questions. This one will be a bit more, each one I think a little bit disconnected. The first questioner, and many of the questioners, by the way, are also extending their thanks for your presentation and the informative discussion. So the first questioner notes that Macau has not gone into the, so to speak, political turmoil that Hong Kong has experienced in recent years. And the government of Macau always appears to be so governing. Do you think that Macau will go through a period of tightening political control similar to the tightening of the legal system in Hong Kong? The second questioner has a specific historical question. They ask, can we make parallels between Macau and Switzerland during the Second World War, as neither of them was invaded and both were used as conduits to launder money? And we have another question. Does Macau's basic law recognize Chinese customary law as the Hong Kong basic law does? So I'll give you those for now, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to, I'll just knock out the third one first and just say that I apologize. Does Macau basic law recognize Chinese customary law? I would have to quickly consult the Macau basic law to refresh my memory on that one. I would suggest looking at Articles 8 and 18 for the laws previously in force. And maybe it'll pop into my head exactly what the provision is. If the questioner would like to follow up with if they have a specific citation or something, I'll take a look at it. But maybe that's one I can follow up. If you could give me the email of that person, I'm happy to follow up on that one. Maybe I'll just do them in reverse order, which is also the order that I can really shed knowledge on these topics at the moment. The second one was parallels between Macau and Switzerland, uh, particularly during the Second World War. Yeah, I think the analysis loosely compares. We have a country or a territory that maintains neutrality, even though that it is surrounded. It becomes a place for money laundering. It becomes a place of intrigue. I think Macau was more espionage and intrigue than maybe Switzerland. The reason being, Switzerland was completely surrounded. Macau uh, during this time period still hosted occasional meetings between Japanese and British and other European power forces, Chinese forces in the region. So Macau was still a center for these type of um, espionage activities as well as track two kind of communications between the different powers. I'm not sure if Switzerland did the same diplomatic role or not, but certainly the money laundering and such was there. Macau benefited very, very much, of course, from gold. Macau is big in the gold industry, by the way. Once the United States went off the gold standard, again in the 1960s, the Bretton Woods Agreement, Macau becomes a major, major flow through of gold and becomes rich on that. And many politically influential people, including Pedro Lobo, who was a hugely influential founder of modern Macau, one of these go-betweens between the Chinese and Portuguese authorities during the 1960s and 1970s. The character of Dr. No in Ian Fleming's James Bond, Dr. No, I'm sorry, Goldfinger, not Dr. No. Goldfinger was actually based on Pedro Lobo in Macau. At least a theory out there, a very credible theory out there says. So there are definitely some parallels there. Macau, though, it cannot be understated. If we're going to talk about World War II, Macau did everything it could, the government of Macau did everything it could to support the massive influx of refugees from mainland China. And there were, if you can imagine, the city grew in size 5 times at least. It went from a couple 100,000 to darn near 1 million people. So the Macau government actually was forced to sell off all of its assets. It sells off its radio tower and it sells off its ships and it sells them to the Japanese provincial government in Guangdong in order to get rice to feed the people on the streets of Macau. So during this time period, they leave no stone unturned. They impoverish themselves, trying to do as well as they can in the situation, an impossible situation. The question there that I'm most able to speak to at the moment is the political turmoil, especially when we look at Hong Kong and Macau in comparison. And there's different reasons for this. There has not been a lot of action in Macau on the democratization front or agitation for it. The reasons being, I think, are essentially the Chinese Communist Party was in charge of Macau from the 1960s. So the handover, for all intents and purposes, for the Chinese community really occurred in 1966, 1967, when the Portuguese government was brought to its knees, forced to apologize, forced to pay reparations, and forced to sort of only govern itself and consult with the Chinese authority moving forward for any major changes. At that point, it's the United Front and the Kaifeng associations which take responsibility for the welfare of the Chinese community in Macau. Um, there was no strong Portuguese concern as to their legacy as far as education goes or language. The population of Macau is 1/10 that of Hong Kong, which just simply makes it easier to govern bureaucratically. The one trick economy of Macau, being that it is not an independent financial center, but it is monopoly on gaming makes it susceptible. The GDP of Macau is very, very high. I said that at the beginning. Macau people, generally speaking, have a very high quality of life. Not a lot of education. They can go straight from high school into the casinos and make a lot of money doing so. And so, why would you? I can see from the perspective of a society at large, why would you try to rock that boat? If Beijing tomorrow could say, we're going to open a new casino city on Hainan Island, and we're going to put Macau out of business, and all of your salaries are going to be chopped in half, and half of you are going to lose your jobs. I mean, that's an unspoken sword of Damocles hanging over the city of Macau. Um, and so that is there as well. It's harder to articulate dissent within the Macau legislature because the Macau legislature has always been three parts. One part is in universal suffrage, but it's not you directly vote for candidates, you vote for candidate lists, which is a little bit uninspiring. The parties, put forward who is going to represent the party at the end of the day in those one-third of seats. One-third of the seats are functional constituencies, sort of as we know them, and one-third of the seats are appointed by the governor himself. And Hong Kong, of course, was a little bit more liberal because it was 50-50 universal suffrage and functional constituencies. It was enough that the pro-democratic forces could articulate their vision, but not bring it into fruition, right? They could always articulate what they wanted, but the system was always stacked so that they could not manifest the political will to realize it. And now talking about Macauization, we see the plan from March 2021 to create this tripartite Hong Kong legislature where one-third of the seats are going to be based on the election committee. And it reminds me very much of the one-third of the seats which are appointed by the Hong Kong or by the Macau chief executive themselves. So I think, I don't know if Sunny Lo, if he's in attendance, but when he speaks about Macauization, I don't know if he intended it to encompass that as well, because this is such a new development. But I dare say it rings with his theory, at least as far as I understand it. So for all of those reasons, we don't see as much activity. I think I want to add one more thing, which is, of course, the national security law. Most of you probably know that Article 23 is a thing in both the Hong Kong and Macau basic laws. Hong Kong, of course, had its flirtation with drafting it in 2003, where it was rejected for fear of what it would do to local common law and local freedom of press and speech and all of those things. That exact phrasing of the 2003 version gets adopted in Macau in 2009. So Macau adopts the original Hong Kong Article 23 legislation in 2009. And I think it's a conceit, but the story is that it has never been triggered. It's never been used in Macau. Maybe as a formalistic matter, that's true. But the Macau authorities have been keen to, constrain June 4th vigils. They've been keen to interdict protesters heading to the Macau Square. They've been keen to clamp down on academics who write negatively about the regime. And so these things have all been done under provisions of standard Macau law. So they've not triggered Macau Article 23, but we still see these national security themes that occurred during the post-handover era, and I think continue to. And of course, finally, the national security law, we all know, Article 38 says it applies to everybody, everywhere in the world, whether you're a Hong Kong or a Chinese resident or not. It applies to me, it applies to you. That certainly means it applies in Macau. So if you're in Macau, you're doing these things. If you're in the US and you can violate the law, you can be in Macau and you can violate the law. Again, we'll just have to see to what extent the Chinese Public Security Bureau comes into the open in Macau to the same way it has in Hong Kong moving forward. I expect that it will in the years ahead.
Okay, many thanks for those answers. We're I guess at our limit on time, but thank you so much for such a rich, informative, fantastic, truly fascinating talk where you took us through so many different time periods, so many different interactions and kind of cross-pollinations of law and ideas and sort of types of orders. I'm sure, I would be very happy to drill down into all sorts of different aspects of the history if we had much more time. But that's just a testament to how rich this conversation was. So I'm sure, and I know from all the questions coming in and appreciations of thanks, the audience found it immensely informative and valuable.